Hi, this is Steve with Palladino Power Project. Bring you a new video on what is Sweetspot and how does it apply to training with a run power device. Let's get into this. A sweet spot is a term and concept that evolved in the early 2000s, and this was one of the diagrams from when it was first presented. It was a diagram that was prepared by Dr. Coggin, Andrew Coggin, PhD, and presented by Frank Overton at Fast Cat Coaching. So this concept sort of arose working together back in the early 2000s. And I want to emphasize it was a concept, originally presented or formulated as a concept, and again, back in the early 2000s, and presented in this format in about 2004 with the help of Dr. Coggin and Frank Overton at Fast Cat Coaching. So this is what we had. I want to talk a little bit more about the concept. The concept is really one where its biggest return on investment for developing functional threshold power or critical power. They're both essentially the same thing conceptually. Functional threshold power and critical power, same concept. Just different values may arise from different protocols and different models, but they're the same concept. So the concept of sweet spot is the concept of getting a large volume of training, a relatively large volume of training that's sustainable and has a desirable effect for developing functional threshold power, critical power. And so this diagram depicts the maximum duration that can be sustained at a certain intensity. And so the higher intensity, the lower volume you can get of that intensity, and the lower the intensity, conversely, the higher the volume. And the other aspect is the physiologic strain. And again, lower volume, lower physiologic strain, and that ramps up into the very high intensities where you have higher physiologic strain. By the way, if we look at pretty much every running training intensity distribution, it's always heavily loaded down here on this side, on easy intensities, easy aerobic intensities. The reason is it's low physiologic strain, high duration, so you have the ability to really get some adaptations for mitochondrial development and type 1, type 2A fibers, etc., or 2X fibers. So that's why you see that in most running training intensity distributions, whether it's 80-20, which is really not 80-20. When Seiler first presented 80-20, it was based on session types, and he later came out and said that if we're doing accounting by duration in each zone, so to speak, it's really more like 90-10 or 85-15 max. He says if you try to get 80-20, you're going to burn yourself out. He actually said that. So 80-20 does not apply to duration in zone. And so the 80-20 concept is really a 90-10 concept when you look at it in terms of duration, or a pyramidal approach. It's always, a TID is always going to be heavier loaded down here in the easy aerobic range. So that was a little tangent. Apologize for that, but it helps to explain this. So in this area here, denoted by that dotted or dashed oval, we can see that we have sort of uh, the grouping or the pairing of relatively high volume and relatively high effect on developing critical power and threshold, such that this is the area where you get the most return on investment and you could do a sustainably high volume of training. Not all training. I'll get to that in a second. So you might even say that the oval could possibly be presented if you look at only the training effect that extends from maybe mid 80% of CP to midway between 100 and 110% is the highest training effect. But in terms of sustainability and volume, it's really below 100% of CP FTP, extending down somewhat, and where you have this high training effect and ability to sustain a fairly high volume of training in that area. So that's the concept. It's a very important concept. Return on investment, bang for the buck, whatever you want to call it. Sweet spot is a training domain, a domain of training intensities and durations that will really allow you to stack it up and get good development of threshold power. So the problem with this, the concept was presented, but it sort of got twisted a little bit in the application. So it wasn't really defined as a specific intensity zone. In fact, later in this presentation, I'll get into why it needs to be individualized, and it really is a domain that sort of floats based on the individual characteristics. But it unfortunately became defined as in some cases, it went beyond the concept of being defined as a specific intensity zone, a training zone, so to speak. And that's a little bit unfortunate. It gets away from the concept. The other thing, it was certainly not put out there. Sweetspot was not developed. That concept was not developed to suggest that it is an all-in training intensity distribution, meaning everything is done in the sweet spot. All training is done in the sweet spot. No. It wasn't defined that, and unfortunately, yeah, there are a handful of cyclists, particularly ones that have low availability of training hours, that do predominantly sweet spot training. That's a handful, but elites do not train that way in cycling, and certainly runners do not train that way with an all-in training intensity distribution. They just don't. So it wasn't intended as such, and unfortunately, there were some scientific research papers that studied training intensity distribution side by side and included what they called threshold TID, which is all in, everything done in the sweet spot. And shame on them, because that's not really a common or suggested training intensity distribution. Just isn't. So shame on them for actually looking at it. So yeah, look at polarized versus pyramidal, sure, but threshold all in, no, not really. So let's come back to originally not specified as an intensity zone. So, as I said, unfortunately, it has evolved from a concept of bang for your buck, return on investment in a general area relative to FTP-CP, close to and below. Uh, it's evolved from a concept to some people actually put out specific training intensities. And let's talk a little bit more about that. So you can see this original diagram ran from about 70% of FTP-CP up to 100%. Pretty wide zone or intensity domain. That's how the diagram is really originally put out. But Dr. Coggin has recently said, this is just this year, and he said this many times before, that the intent, the emphasis was that sweet spot is first and foremost a concept. But if one insists on harder criteria, he considers to extend from about the level 2, level 3 border, or quote unquote their aerobic threshold, up to FTP or FTP-CP, that second phase transition. All right, so he tightens that domain up a little bit higher. If you're going in running terms, at maybe 80%, it could be down here 77% is aerobic threshold for some runners, or even a little bit lower. So this sort of floats a little bit on this end, but just in general terms, about 80 to 100% is the sweet spot in general. Broad terms. Frank Overton has defined it as 84 to 97%, which is also captured by intervals.icu in their platform as 84 to 97%. Again, defining it as a specific a zone, so to speak, going beyond the concept. So 84 to 97% by these two platforms, or individual in the sense of, in the case of Frank Overton. And it narrows down a little bit more. Hunter Allen recently published a similar diagram without the big dashed oval, and described sweet spot as 88 to 93%. Train Road is 88 to 94%. WKO is 88 to 95%. So 88 as the bottom, and somewhere in here between 93 and 95% for these platforms. So it's again, it wasn't originally intended as a specific intensity training zone, so to speak, but a concept. And with various individuals and platforms, it's been varyingly described as different widths of that particular intensity domain. I will put out that the Norwegian concept, based on lactate, which LT2 is that second phase transition, as is CP and FTP. They may not come up with the same intensity precisely, but they're both, when I say both, I mean FTP, CP versus lactate threshold 2 or maximum lactate steady state. They're all trying to define that second phase transition. I did a recent video on this, or incorporating that particular discussion. So I'll put the link for that video in the description of this video in case you missed it. Anyway, getting back to Norwegian concepts. The Norwegian concept, again, it's the concept that you do a lot of training, not the whole training intensity distribution, but a substantial portion of that in this big return on investment intensity domain, which is just below thresholds extending down to maybe about marathon power. So, sweet spot is the same concept as the Norwegian concept of training using lactate threshold as the ceiling for that domain. Okay, so very similar concepts, the sweet spot and the Norwegian concept of subthreshold training. In that other video that I just mentioned, and we'll link in the description of this video, I presented this slide, which talks about the two threshold or two phase transition anchor points. One being the first phase transition, which in power sense, it's conversational effort running, and it's usually less than 80% of FTP-CP, valid FTP-CP. And the other anchor point is right here at the second phase transition, which also is attempted to be defined by MLSS and lactate threshold 2, ventilatory threshold 2, respiratory compensation point. All try to identify this phase transition, but in power sense, in run power, it's critical power, functional threshold power. So two anchors to help guide training intensity distribution, training intensity prescription. So I presented this slide, and then I made it somewhat practical by putting some of these common domains that we try to prescribe into for run training. And I mentioned this one, this little oval here, placed in the upper end of the heavy domain, is, it's curiously close to the sweet spot, where we do subthreshold intervals and tempo work. And it's all done below critical power, functional threshold power as the ceiling. So I presented this slide and even went on to putting some common race power areas, domains. And if you notice, if you know Norwegian singles concept of training, they talk about 10 to 15K effort, half marathon power effort, 30K effort. So I put those in there to show you how they're distributed in that heavy domain, which is where we typically prescribe subthreshold and tempo intervals. So let's focus on that because that aligns really well with this sweet spot concept, or the Norwegian concept in more contemporary terminology. Let's focus on that area, and let's take away that oval, and I'm putting in these sort of marker points. This is 100% of CP FTP. This is 80%. So this is 90%, 85, and 95%. That's why I put those markers there, just so it'll frame our discussion that we're about to have. And we'll strip these. Well, we'll keep those race power intensities in, but notice how they are going to move. Now, this is critical power level 3, about 3.5 to 4.2 watts per kilogram. That domain of sweet spot or subthreshold training probably extends from about 85% down here to 98% and encompasses these various race domains. If we go to level 4, you can see how we went from level 3 to level 4. It sort of slides to the right a little bit, just a little bit, because their marathon power, given that their marathons are faster, their marathon power is a higher percentage of critical power and FTP. So the bottom end sort of slides up, and so does they're running, say, 10K to 15K. They're running faster because of power duration. The faster means it's at a higher percentage of critical power and FTP. So once again, going from level 3 to level 4, And then if we go from level 5, you can see the bottom sort of sneaks up a little bit because the marathons are even faster. Their marathons are even faster so that they're a higher percentage of FTP. So that the domain shrinks a little bit by moving from the left towards the right here, a little bit higher relative intensity, meaning a higher percentage of FTP CP. We go even higher up into level 6, it shifts a little bit further to the right, both on the right-hand side of that domain as well as the left-hand side of the domain. And if you go to elite, marathon power for elite is 93, 95, 97%. So if you're using marathon power as the low end of this sweet spot, right? In an elite runner, say a 2-hour marathoner, that sweet spot is really tiny. It's sandwiched up here, above 95% of critical power functional threshold power for marathon power. So again, I'm going to go back and we just see how the sweet spot individualizes based on their critical power and which correlates to these race intensities. So it goes from 3 to 4 to 5 to even higher 6 plus. All right. So from my perspective, Palladino Power Project perspective, again, I agree with Dr. Coggin. First and foremost, it's a concept, sweet spot. It is that sub-threshold area that aligns well with the Norwegian subthreshold concept. It's the concept first. But if you had to put numbers on it, it would extend from, in terms of a very broad look at it, from about marathon power on the low end up to about 100% of CP-FTP. But it's not static and hardwired into, it's 85 to 100%. No, it's not. It is not static. It varies by level or even at the individual level, as I demonstrated just in a few slides ago. And the other thing about this sweet spot is that we can distribute stimuli within that sweet spot by having relatively precise or narrow target ranges for a given workout for specified duration. So about 3% wide prescription range, and we smatter our stimuli across this domain. Shorter and a little bit higher percent, that 3%. Down here, still 3% wide, but we're going a little bit longer and maybe a little bit higher volume, but we're still targeting in a precise prescription. So that's my perspective on the sweet spot. And in future videos, we will come back to this slide and this concept, and we'll talk about what I was just saying. Let's look at some specific prescriptions that allow us to target this end or in between. Let's look at different ways and different prescription patterns for addressing training in that sweet spot. Then after that video, I'll probably do another video on how to work sweet spot into training intensity distributions. So we'll come back to this slide, which was presented in that previous video as well, by the way. And then lastly, we'll come back with even another video where we start talking about the severe domain and some of the prescription patterns that allow us to prescribe up in here on the higher than CP-FTP domain and how we do that. So thank you for watching. Hopefully this helped give you a little bit better appreciation of the concept of sweet spot and more learning about the domain and how it fits in with contemporary discussions, i.e., Norwegian concepts. And yeah, hopefully this helps. Thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time. Bye bye.